In the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. German forces were collapsing on both fronts. Allied soldiers were moving through Germany, liberating prisoner of war camps, displaced persons camps, labor camps, finding hundreds of thousands of people who had somehow survived years of Nazi captivity. People who had endured things that are difficult to put into words. People who had waited through everything for the moment when the guns stopped and they could go home. For some of those people, the moment the guns stopped was the most terrifying moment of the entire war. Because home, for them, meant Stalin. Home meant the Soviet Union. Home meant a system that had already decided, before they were even back on Soviet soil, that they were traitors. That any Soviet citizen who had been captured by the Germans, or who had worked in Germany, or who had ended up on the wrong side of the front line for any reason at all, was an enemy of the state, was guilty, was to be punished, and Winston Churchill, along with Franklin Roosevelt, had agreed to send them back. Not voluntarily, not if they wanted to go, forcibly, with British and American soldiers physically loading them onto trains and trucks and ships under armed guard and handing them to Soviet authorities who were waiting on the other side of the border with lists of names and plans for what came next. People knew what was waiting for them. They begged not to go. They showed their wounds, their scars, their evidence of what the Nazis had done to them, as if this would change the decision. Some of them attacked the Allied soldiers loading them onto the transports, not to escape, because there was nowhere to escape to, but out of the pure animal desperation of people being sent towards something they knew they could not survive. Some of them killed themselves, rather than go back, rather than face what was waiting on the other side. Men and women, and sometimes children, choosing death in a displaced persons camp in Germany over what Stalin had prepared for them at home. Churchill knew this was happening. The reports reached London. The Foreign Office knew. The War Office knew. And the operation continued. This is the story of Operation Keelhaul, the most complete moral failure of Churchill's wartime leadership, the decision that history has struggled to look at directly for 80 years. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand Operation Keelhaul, you need to understand the Yalta Agreement, the deal that created it. In February 1945, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met at the Levadia Palace in Yalta, in the Crimea. It was the last meeting of the Big Three before the end of the war in Europe. Roosevelt was visibly dying. The photographs from Yalta show a man being held together by will alone, his face hollowed out, his body failing. Churchill was exhausted after 5 years of war. And Stalin was, as always, entirely in control of himself and entirely clear about what he wanted. One of the things Stalin wanted was his people back. During the course of the war, enormous numbers of Soviet citizens had ended up outside Soviet control. Some were prisoners of war, soldiers captured by the Germans in the catastrophic early months of Barbarossa, when entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Some were Ostarbeiter, forced laborers transported to Germany to work in German factories and farms. Some were members of the Russian Liberation Army, Soviet citizens who had, for various reasons, ended up fighting on the German side. Some were simply displaced, people swept up by the chaos of the largest land war in history and deposited, alive but stateless, in the middle of a continent that was destroying itself. By the end of the war, there were between 5 and 6 million Soviet citizens in Western Allied hands, and Stalin wanted them back. All of them. Without exception, without individual review of their cases, without any process by which someone could demonstrate that they had been a prisoner rather than a collaborator, a victim rather than a traitor. Stalin's position was simple. They were Soviet citizens. The Soviet Union wanted them. Hand them over. Churchill and Roosevelt agreed. The agreement was signed at Yalta on February 11, 1945. In exchange for Soviet cooperation on other matters, the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, cooperation on the structure of the post-war United Nations, various territorial arrangements in Europe, the Western Allies agreed to repatriate all Soviet citizens in their custody. The word repatriate sounds neutral, clinical, administrative. It is the word that was used in the documents, in the diplomatic communications, in the official record. What it meant in practice was this. British and American soldiers would go into the displaced persons camps where Soviet citizens were being held, and they would load those people onto transport vehicles. If the people refused to get on the vehicles, the soldiers would use force. If people resisted, they would be physically restrained. If they ran, they would be caught, and they would be handed to Soviet authorities at agreed transfer points along the border between the Western and Soviet zones of occupation. What happened to them after the handover was not the concern of the Western Allies. That was the agreement. Now let me tell you what actually happened to them, because the Soviet system had already decided, before a single transport arrived, what category these people fell into. Stalin's order. Number 270, issued in August 1941, had declared that any Soviet soldier who allowed himself to be captured was a traitor, not a victim, not a prisoner, a traitor. The order made no distinction between soldiers who surrendered and soldiers who were captured unconscious, wounded, overwhelmed. If you were in German hands, you were guilty. The returning Soviet citizens were processed through a filtration system, camps where NKVD officers reviewed each person's case and made a determination. The determinations fell into categories. Some people were cleared and allowed to return to their homes. Some were sent to labor battalions. Some were sent to the Gulag, and some, a significant number, though the exact figure is disputed by historians, were shot. The filtration system was not neutral. It was not designed to find the truth about what had happened to each individual. It was designed to process a security threat. And the presumption was guilt. People who had been prisoners of war, who had been captured fighting for the Soviet Union, who had spent years in German camps, who had survived conditions that killed millions of others, came back to the Soviet Union and were sent to the Gulag for the crime of having survived German captivity. The logic was specific and monstrous. If you survived, you must have collaborated. If you were truly a loyal Soviet citizen, you would have died rather than allow yourself to be taken. Churchill knew the broad outlines of this. Not every detail. The Soviet filtration system was not transparent, and the full scale of what was happening to the returnees only became clear over time. But the British government was not ignorant. There were reports. There was intelligence. There was the straightforward logic of what Stalin's regime did to people it regarded as security risks, which was what it regarded all of these people as. And the operation continued. Let me tell you about some specific incidents, because the statistics, 2 million people hundreds of thousands sent to the Gulag, unknown numbers shot, are too large to hold in your mind all at once. The specific incidents are smaller. They fit inside your field of vision, and they tell you what Operation Keelhaul actually was in human terms. In May 1945, at a place called Lienz in Austria, there were approximately 40,000 Cossacks, members of a Cossack military formation that had ended up fighting alongside the Germans, not always voluntarily, in the later stages of the war. With them were their families, women, children, elderly people who had been following the military formation as it retreated westward before the Soviet advance. The British forces in the area received orders to repatriate these Cossacks to the Soviet Union. The Cossack leaders were invited to a conference. They were told it was a meeting to discuss their situation. They were loaded into vehicles and driven to a transfer point where they were handed to Soviet authorities. The officers who led them had believed, until that moment, that their surrender to British forces meant something, that there would be a process, that their cases would be considered. There was no process. There was no consideration. There was a vehicle, a transfer point, and Soviet soldiers waiting on the other side. When the Cossack rank and file, the soldiers and their families, realized what was happening, the scenes that followed were described by the British soldiers who witnessed them as the most distressing experiences of their military careers. Men who had fought through the entire war broke down. Women held their children and refused to move. People knelt and prayed. People begged. People offered everything they had, their watches, their rings, their last possessions, in exchange for being allowed to stay. British soldiers used rifle butts to force people onto the trucks. There were soldiers who wept while doing it. There were soldiers who requested transfers rather than continue. There were officers who filed formal complaints through the chain of command. The operation continued. At Dachau, the liberated concentration camp in Bavaria, there were Soviet citizens among the survivors of Nazi captivity. People who had been in the camps, who bore the specific marks of what the Nazi system did to the people it imprisoned. These people were told they were being repatriated to the Soviet Union. Some of them barricaded themselves inside buildings and refused to come out. American soldiers broke down the doors and physically dragged them to the transports. At various locations across the Western occupation zones, there were incidents of mass suicide. People who had survived the Nazi camps, who had survived the war, who had endured everything the 20th century could throw at them, chose to die rather than go back. They hung themselves. They cut their wrists. They threw themselves from buildings. They walked into rivers. The reports of these suicides reached London. They reached the Foreign Office. They reached the level of government where decisions were made, and the operation continued. Now here's the question that sits at the center of this story and will not go away. Why? Why did Churchill agree to this? Why did he sustain the operation when reports of suicides and forced removals were reaching his government? What was the logic, if there was logic, behind the decision? The answers are several, and some of them have more merit than others. The first answer is reciprocity. Britain had its own citizens in Soviet-controlled territory. British prisoners of war who had been liberated by Soviet forces advancing through Germany and Poland. Churchill wanted those men back. The deal was, in its most basic form, an exchange. You return ours, we return yours. The British prisoners were returned. They came home to Britain, they were debriefed, and they went back to their families. The Soviet citizens who were returned did not go home to their families. They went to the filtration camps. So the reciprocity argument has this problem. It only works as a justification if the two sides of the exchange are equivalent. British prisoners returning to Britain and freedom was not equivalent to Soviet citizens returning to Stalin's system and the Gulag. Churchill knew this. The equivalence was false, and at some level, he knew it was false. The second answer is alliance maintenance. The relationship with Stalin was the central strategic fact of the closing stages of the war and the opening of the post-war period. Stalin was insisting on repatriation. He was using it as a test of Western commitment to agreements made at Yalta. If Churchill refused, if Britain said no, we will not forcibly return your citizens, Stalin would have had grounds to argue that the West was harboring Soviet traitors, that the West was undermining the Soviet war effort, that the agreements made at Yalta were not worth the paper they were written on. Churchill had spent 4 years building and sustaining the alliance with Stalin. He had swallowed enormous amounts to keep it functional. The percentages agreement, the silence over Poland, the concessions at Yalta. From Churchill's perspective, breaking with Stalin over the repatriation question, at the precise moment when the war was ending and the shape of the post-war world was being determined, was a cost he was not willing to pay. The problem with this argument is that the war was ending. The alliance was already transforming into competition. The Iron Curtain was already descending. The strategic calculation that had made maintaining Stalin's goodwill worth almost any price was becoming obsolete, even as Operation Keelhaul was being carried out. Churchill was still reasoning in wartime logic at a moment when the situation had already moved past it. The third answer is the one that is hardest to say, but closest to the truth. Churchill, at some level, did not fully individualize the people being returned. They were Soviet citizens. They were Stalin's problem. The specifics of what happened to them after the handover, the filtration camps, the Gulag, the executions, were things that happened on the other side of a line that Churchill had drawn around his area of responsibility. This is the same quality of thinking, if you can call it thinking, that produced the Bengal famine policy. The same ability to abstract away the specific human beings and deal with the category. Soviet citizens, Indians, people on the other side of a line that made them someone else's concern. It is not a comfortable thing to say about a man who also gave the speech about fighting on the beaches, who also stayed in London during the Blitz, who also refused to surrender when surrender would have been rational. But Churchill was capable of both of these things simultaneously. The moral clarity that made him great in some directions was completely absent in others. There were people within Churchill's government who raised objections, who said in internal communications that are now in the archive that what was being done was wrong, that the forced repatriation of people who faced death on return was a violation of the principles Britain had claimed to be fighting for. Those objections were noted and overridden. The scale of Operation Keelhaul is disputed by historians. The Soviet archives, to the extent they have been opened, give partial and unreliable figures. Western estimates have ranged from 1.5 million to nearly 3 million people forcibly repatriated between 1945 and 1947. The operation continued after Churchill left office. It was sustained by the Attlee government, with American participation, until the late 1940s. Of those returned, a significant but unquantifiable number were shot. A much larger number went to the Gulag. Some survived the Gulag and were eventually released in the years after Stalin's death in 1953. Some survived long enough to tell their stories to historians. Nikolai Tolstoy, the historian who did more than anyone to bring Operation Keelhaul to public attention, in his 1977 book, Victims of Yalta, interviewed survivors in the 1970s. Old men and women by then, carrying the specific weight of people who had survived something that most of their companions had not. Their accounts of the repatriation itself, the British soldiers with rifle butts, the trucks, the transfer points, the Soviet soldiers waiting, are some of the most difficult reading in the literature of the Second World War. Not because the violence was the worst violence of that war. The war contained worse violence, but because of the specific betrayal involved. These people had surrendered to British and American forces. They had placed themselves in Allied hands because they believed, because they had reason to believe, because the Allies presented themselves as the champions of the values that distinguished them from the Nazi and Soviet systems, that they would be treated according to those values. They were not. Churchill's legacy is large enough to contain this. The man who refused to surrender in 1940, who sustained Britain through its darkest hours, who built the alliance that destroyed Nazi Germany, that man also agreed to Operation Keelhaul, signed the agreement at Yalta, received the reports of forced removals and suicides, and continued. History does not simplify its great figures. Churchill was not simple. He was capable of extraordinary moral courage and of extraordinary moral failure, sometimes in the same week, sometimes about the same war. Operation Keelhaul is the part of Churchill's war record that his admirers find most difficult to address. Because it is not a failure of policy or strategy. It is not a mistake made in conditions of uncertainty and time pressure. It is a decision made with knowledge, sustained with knowledge, producing consequences that were foreseeable and foreseen. The people who were loaded onto those trucks in the spring and summer of 1945, the Cossacks at Lienz, the camp survivors at Dachau, the displaced persons across hundreds of camps in Germany and Austria, they were counting on something. They were counting on the West being different from what they were running from. On the agreement to surrender meaning something. On the values in the speeches being real. Churchill let them down, completely, knowingly, in writing. That is the complete record. And the complete record is the only honest way to look at history. If this video gave you something real, something the official version leaves out, hit that like button. This channel exists to tell the full story, not the cleaned up version. Not the version that fits on a statue, the version that actually happened. Subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you in the next one.